If it's Monday, the search for suspects intensifies in Baltimore after 30 people were shot, 2 fatally, at a block party this weekend as a city and a nation struggle to address the intensifying issue of gun violence. Plus, former President Trump and a crowded field of Republican candidates sounded off on culture war issues spotlighted by the Supreme Court, and a video promoted by the DeSantis campaign touting his targeting of transgender individuals. And White House officials are monitoring an increasingly violent and deadly situation in the Mideast after Israeli forces launched multiple drone strikes and sending ground troops to the West Bank city of Jenin, calling it a counter-terror operation. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We are once again facing the fallout from a weekend of gun violence as the nation grapples with the mass shooting crisis that has become tragically American. In Baltimore, 2 adults were killed and 28 other people were injured in a shooting at a block party early Sunday morning. More than a dozen of those hurt were minors. As the search for suspects continues, police today calling on the community for help. Take a listen.
Right now, our detectives are still working through interviewing every one of the victims. We will continue to pursue any leads. So that's why we need the help from the community, because we have only touched some of the video that's out there. Everyone had their cameras working, had their phones working, and there's much more video out there that we have to look at.
Police also say they fear there could be a cycle of violent retaliation kicked off by this weekend's shooting as they try to determine whether this incident was in response to a prior incident earlier in the week.
We're always concerned about retaliation in every single incident. We have a crime meeting that's going on right now while we're having the press conference where all our commanders are talking about what happened between over the weekend and what happened between Monday and Wednesday.
Now, just hours after the shooting in Baltimore, 7 people were shot when a gunman opened fire in a nightclub in Wichita, Kansas. 1 person is in custody, and police say it appears gunshots came from at least 4 firearms. So far this year, there have been at least 340 mass shootings nationwide. According to the Gun Violence Archive, that's a pace of roughly 2 mass shootings every single day, with more than 9,000 gun-related deaths, not including suicides. Baltimore's mayor told reporters today that his city is certainly not alone as it struggles to address this issue.
This is not just a Baltimore thing. We have to be honest. This is the United States of America. This is our longest standing public health challenge. We are talking about now having over 300 mass shootings in this country, where we pride ourselves on being the leaders of the free world. But we cannot seem to get to a point where we're going to have the lives of American citizens mean more than American citizens' ability to have guns.
NBC's George Solis joins me now from Baltimore. George, here we are talking about yet another mass shooting. So bring us up to speed here. Are police any closer to naming a suspect or making an arrest?
Yeah, you really heard it there during the press conference today, Kristen. Authorities are asking the community, they're asking the public to come forward with information because they know somebody out there saw something. They know this was a large gathering. There were many cell phones. There were people recording the event. And so they know someone out there has video of this shooter or shooters that opened fire on this crowd, killing those 2 young individuals, that 18-year-old woman and that 20-year-old man. A $28,000 reward now on the table for information. At this point, authorities say they still have no word on a suspect or a motive. As you mentioned, retaliation here is always a concern during these large types of gatherings. And a big question that a number of people in the community have is why this event was not more staffed with authorities, considering this is an annual block party that takes place. Officials say they will be investigating that as well, Kristen.
George, let me follow up with you on that point, because this was a block party and yet they did not have a permit, which is typically necessary with this type of an event. So how is that factoring into the investigation? What are authorities saying about that?
Yeah, this is a question that was repeatedly asked during today's press conference of the acting police commissioner. if this is an event that the city knows that takes place annually, why was it not well staffed? Their answer, they know that it takes place around the same time each year, and they normally have a lot of resources at hand. They are still looking into why maybe it wasn't the case this year. I asked the police commissioner specifically if there was a shortage of police officers. He says no, they had adequate staffing within the district that could have responded to this event should the need have arisen. And he's saying that this is something that just kind of fell through the cracks in so many words, that it wasn't advertised on social media as it is normally. So authorities simply just didn't know it was going on. And that right now at the moment is the best answer they're giving us, Kristen.
George Solis, we've been watching your reporting throughout the weekend, throughout the day. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. We really appreciate it. We want to turn now to the political fallout from the Supreme Court decisions handed down at the end of the term. The High Court ruled against the hopes of the White House and Democrats on three major matters late last week: affirmative action, LGBTQ rights, and the president's plan for student loan forgiveness. Over the weekend, the Republican presidential candidates praised each of those rulings. Here they are.
We appointed nearly 300 federal judges and 3 great Supreme Court justices. And this week, those justices ruled to move our country forward with a merit-based system of education. How big is that?
What the Supreme Court showed is regardless of where you're born and raised, what color you are, what gender you are going to be able to have individual freedom, and that's a win for the United States of America.
This business has no right not to serve people of a protected class, but by the same token, the government doesn't have the right to tell a business the nature of how they need to use their expressive abilities.
The majority of people that would have benefited from this student loan forgiveness are people with multiple graduate degrees. So you're going to say to working Americans, to truck drivers, to people working in the trades, we're going to take your taxes and pay down a part of the student debt of doctors and lawyers and PhDs.
Now, on the issue of student loans, President Biden vowed late Friday to keep fighting using the power of the White House.
But today's decision has closed one path. Now we're going to pursue another. I'm never going to stop fighting for you. We'll use every tool at our disposal to get you the student debt relief you need and reach your dreams. It's good for the economy. It's good for the country. It's going to be good for you.
NBC's senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell has been tracking these decisions and the arguments when they were in the argument phase as well. Kelly, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate it. Let's talk about what President Biden says he is going to do. He says he's going to use every tool at his disposal for student loan relief. And yet, in your reporting, you have made the point the timeline is very uncertain, and it's not clear that he's not going to get challenged on any future actions. What's the very latest?
Well, Kristen, what the president is trying to do is find another legal pathway. So using a different piece of legislation that already exists and to find within that the power to have the Department of Education look at writing new rules for student loans. And that requires some public comment period, having a public hearing, different steps that would need to be taken to try to set up a whole new program on student loan forgiveness. And we don't at this point know which borrowers this would affect, how much of their debt could be forgiven. And because this is such a politically divisive issue, expect that there would still be legal challenges made, and we might be again in the process of seeing this go through the courts. The Supreme Court simply said the justification used by the administration the first time around, which had to do with the COVID national emergency, was not sound, that the president could not wipe out debt under that. So they're looking for another authority to do it. They think they have it in the Higher Education Act, but expect there will be pushback. Still, the president believes this is politically advantageous. He also believes it helps the economy. If people have more money available to spend, they're buying a home, they're investing in their family, they're buying goods and services, and that's good for the economy. And as you heard from the conservative voices, they say it's not fair to shift that burden to a broader base of taxpayers to pay a loan that people agreed to pay back themselves. Kristen?
Kelly, as you and I have been reporting on, the president at the end of last week said that this is not a quote unquote normal court when he was pressed on this matter. How do you expect this to translate into the political discourse, both from what we're seeing from President Biden and what we're going to see from Republicans on the campaign trail?
Well, the president was asked to explain what he meant by that, and to some degree he said he doesn't believe the current court, which has a supermajority of 6 conservatives to 3 liberals, is reflecting American values, in part because they've overturned longstanding precedent when it comes to Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs case last year, when it comes to affirmative action in college admissions, a practice that's been in place for decades, overturning that. And even though the court had affirmed gay marriage and other protections for gay Americans, this narrow rule that came out the other day about free speech, not compelling a business owner to create something artistic or using their free speech for something they don't believe in. And so it wasn't a religious freedom case per se, it was a First Amendment case. And that, too, has a practical implication potentially to be harmful to the LGBTQ community. The president would say that is rolling back where the country actually is. So expect that to be an ongoing flashpoint in the political divide. Certainly conservatives are touting what the Trump years brought to the court with more conservatives changing that balance. And we have seen how issues like abortion rights have also been very animating for voters in states since that was overturned last year, with midterm elections and some special elections, and to have that be a driving issue for 2024. Democrats think it will be.
Yeah, we will be watching that closely. And Kelly O'Donnell, you have been all over these decisions and the fallout from them. Thank you so much for bringing us your reporting. We really appreciate it. Joining me now for more on those Supreme Court decisions is California Democratic Congresswoman Judy Chu. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us on this holiday week. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with where I left off with Kelly O'Donnell, which is that President Biden has made this promise to take steps to address the issue of student loan forgiveness. Obviously, there are still going to be hurdles, as Kelly just mapped out. How confident are you that he is going to be able to follow through with the promises of actually getting relief to millions of Americans?
Well, I give credit to President Biden in starting very early on when he could anticipate what the court decision might be. And he is already taking steps to reduce the loan payment from 10% to 5% of a student's income, and then having a process by which they can moderate the way that loan payments are made through a new rule. And they are looking at loan forgiveness for low-income students. So these are things that can provide relief. But I do think that, considering the fact that the student loan moratorium will lift as of September, many students are worried about what will happen to them. And they were looking towards the student debt relief as a way of being able to make ends meet in the fall. So I think it's a huge disappointment to millions of Americans. I am glad that President Biden is doing what he can, but it wouldn't have been as immediate as student debt relief.
And I guess the question for these students as they watch and wait to see what happens next is, why should they have confidence that the president's actions now are going to be successful when he was just blocked by the Supreme Court?
He has lawyers that are looking at the viability of these particular actions, so they are being very careful. I have confidence that they are taking steps that will be upheld by the legal system, and that they are steps that are within his purview that can be done. They are taking into account the way that these loan payments are made. And I think even though those are more moderate steps, I think they are certainly within his jurisdiction.
You know, it was interesting. The president was asked on Friday why he gave students false hope that they would get this student loan relief. He denied that that's what he was doing. But do you think he offered false hope to students with these executive orders?
I believe he did what the public needed. The public was calling for student debt relief, and we heard this over and over again. And we saw that with the moratorium on payments. there was tremendous relief among students, and you know, it was for the last few years during COVID. So I think it was a natural outgrowth of that to have a student debt relief. And he did what was in his conscience, and also what would help the economy, because then these students would be able to live on with their lives and inject these funds into the economy. And let's not forget that college costs have increased 3 times since 1980, and yet wages have not kept up with it.
Congresswoman, the president was asked about the court. He said it was not a normal court. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you worry that attacking the court could further undermine people's confidence in our nation's institutions?
I totally agree that this is not a normal court. This is an extremist right-wing court. They overturned 50 years of precedent under the Dobbs decision. They overturned 50 years of precedent on the affirmative action decision. They are not paying attention to precedent, despite what Justice Kavanaugh said in his Supreme Court hearing. So, no, this is not a normal court, and I think there has to be change. I think that the public is losing confidence in the Supreme Court as a checks and balance to our system in America.
President Biden has consistently said he is opposed to court packing, what's called court packing, adding more seats to the Supreme Court. Where are you on that issue in the wake of these latest rulings? Would you consider it at this point?
Well, I'm actually a co-sponsor on the bill that would increase the number of justices from 9 to 13. In my research, I was really surprised to learn that the number of justices is not set in the Constitution, and that prior to the Civil War, it had actually been increased and decreased over a number of times. And finally, in the 1860s, it remained about 9 justices. But there is nothing that says that it must be at that number. And I think now is the time to change it, with this court being appointed under such terrible conditions where, for instance, one justice actually lied when he said that he would respect precedent.
But Congresswoman,
so, yeah.
I guess the counter to that is, where would it end? Because if you add more seats to the court now and Republicans are able to add more seats at some point further down the line, where does it end? And does it not then actually become a completely politicized court?
Well, it could, but here is what I say. I say that now the discussion is really increasing about changes to the Supreme Court. And there is another proposal, actually, that I support, which is term limits. Term limits of 18 years would certainly be sufficient for any Supreme Court justice, and also ensure that every Supreme Court justice would be in good health. So I think that that is also a viable alternative. Whatever the solutions are, there clearly needs to be some Supreme Court reform.
Congresswoman, let me get your take on the Supreme Court's decision to strike down affirmative action in higher education. It has been knocked down in your state of California. You're a former educator, we should point out. Statistics show that Latinos, who make up 40% of your state's population, only make up 22.5% of students enrolled in UC schools. African Americans make up 6.5%, even though, and then they make up much less of the population of schools. How confident are you that these universities who say we are still dedicated to diversifying will be able to achieve that, will be able to meet their own self-imposed goals?
Well, I really have to give credit to the UC-NCSU systems, because they did the most that they could to do outreach to communities of color to ensure that they would enroll. And they've actually made tremendous progress since then. But I do have to say that right after the decision striking down affirmative action in California, half the population of Blacks and Latinos declined in the UC system.
So do you worry about that nationwide, Congresswoman? Do you worry about that nationwide? Because these schools say that, look, they are still dedicated to diversifying their student population. Do you think they'll be able to do that?
I definitely worry about that. I do think that there is great intentions. I have talked to the presidents of these very elite universities. However, I do think that there is going to be inevitably a decline, especially in the immediacy after this decision.
Congresswoman, very quickly before I let you go, when when affirmative action was signed into law, it was imagined as something that would last for 25 years. You have former Vice President Mike Pence saying there may have been a time when affirmative action was necessary simply to open the doors of all our schools and universities, but I think that time has passed. What do you make of that perspective?
Well, can we say that discrimination has ended in this country? I mean, look. There has been 3 years of anti-Asian hate. We've seen hate crimes on the rise in this country. We have seen very polarized kinds of actions taken against communities of color. No, discrimination has not ended in this country, and there are great disparities. Even amongst AAPIs, we see great disparities in education between those on the high end and Pacific Islanders, as well as Southeast Asians, who have very low numbers with regard to completing a college degree. So no, discrimination has not ended in this country, and there are many, many ways in which we could show it.
All right, Congresswoman Judy Chu, thank you so much. We hope you have a wonderful holiday. Appreciate your joining us.
Thank you so much.
Coming up next, courting controversy and the Republican divide over LGBTQ issues as the DeSantis campaign ramps up its rhetoric to close out Pride Month. The panel dives into that. And later, rebuilding ties with Beijing, the White House dispatches Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to China following months of rising military and economic tensions. The very latest ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Governor Ron DeSantis is facing blowback from an anti-LGBTQ video that was reposted by his presidential campaign. The video shows clips of his campaign rival, former President Trump, speaking positively about the LGBTQ community, followed by a sequence highlighting DeSantis' hardline policies on drag shows and transgender people, including headlines calling them draconian, interspersed with images of shirtless men. In an interview yesterday, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, the first openly gay cabinet member, responded to the DeSantis campaign's actions.
And I'm going to leave aside the strangeness of trying to prove your manhood by putting up a video that splices images of you in between oiled up shirtless bodybuilders, and just get to the bigger issue that is on my mind whenever I see this stuff in the policy space, which is, again, who are you trying to help? Who are you trying to make better off? And what public policy problems do you get up in the morning thinking about how to solve?
The video has also been criticized. The video has also been criticized by some on the right, with one prominent group of LGBTQ conservatives calling it, quote, divisive and desperate. Some of DeSantis' 2024 opponents are criticizing it as well. Take a listen to that.
We're trying to make this country, and their debate is trying to make this country smaller. They're trying to divide us further, and it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. This type of video does nothing to address those issues, and it is a teenage, food fight between Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump.
I wish they would focus and focus their attacks on war criminals like Vladimir Putin, not my friends in the LGBTQ community. It is 2023. We should be talking about how do we embrace our differences.
Joining me now, former Democratic Senator from Alabama, Doug Jones, and former Republican Congressman from Pennsylvania, Charlie Dent. Thanks to both of you for joining me on this holiday week. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Senator, let me start with you. What do you make of what you saw in that video, and what does it say about how the culture wars are going to play in the DeSantis campaign?
That was one of the most bizarre videos, much less a campaign video, that I have ever seen. But I think it is emblematic of what is going on in the whole of the Republican Party, where you have that kind of vitriolic, it's just ridiculous video going after the gay community. And on the other hand, you've got a Chris Christie and a Will Hurd trying to take the opposing view, and Donald Trump being kind of silent on this. It's a real mess over there right now, and the culture war is dominant. And that's the thing that, Ron DeSantis has decided he will go all in on the culture war issues. It doesn't matter that what he's got to play to in a general election should he get the nomination. He is going all in and betting on that's where the country is. I'm betting it's not, but he's betting that it is.
Congressman, let me get your take and also just read this from the Log Cabin Republicans, who put out a thread of tweets on that video, writing in part, quote, Ron DeSantis' extreme rhetoric has just ventured into homophobic territory, and DeSantis' rhetoric will lose hard-fought gains in critical races across the nation. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I would certainly agree that the Republican Party, and in this case, Governor DeSantis, needs to stop the culture wars. The party needs to expand its base. It needs to reach out to communities that it has struggled with, including the LGBT community. The party must become more socially tolerant. Those types of videos released by Governor DeSantis move in the opposite direction. I believe that Governor Christie and Congressman Will Hurd are on the right track here. They should be talking about expanding the tent, talk about opportunity, not picking on the LGBT community or the trans community. These are really issues that ought to be set aside. I think it's a terrible mistake for the party. It needs to become more socially tolerant.
I want to get both. Yeah, I want to get both of your takes on what I just find to be fascinating polling. And our latest poll basically shows that DeSantis' potential strengths versus Trump are really the edge that he has with moderate GOP voters who see him as the non-MAGA candidate. So, Congressman, just back to you quickly, does a video like this risk alienating some of those gettable voters that are out there for the taking for DeSantis?
Yeah, absolutely. To the extent that they are, again, going after the LGBT community, passing 6-week abortion bans in Florida. These are not issues that will appeal to that suburban voter, those swing voters in key districts and states around the country. Again, it is really limiting the appeal of the party. For the party to become a national party, it has to become much more socially tolerant and inclusive. This is going in the absolute wrong direction. It will hurt Ron DeSantis with the non-Trump voters. Yeah, it'll help those who like Trump's policies but don't like Trump, but it's not going to help DeSantis with people who do not like Donald Trump or a lot of his policies or this hard right turn of some candidates like DeSantis.
Senator, part of what we're seeing here is these candidates trying to figure out how to go against Trump. And so you have DeSantis, who's trying to run to the right of Trump on a range of different issues. And you have other candidates who are hesitant to attack him because they don't want to alienate his supporters. Is that a strategy that can work right now? Or does Chris Christie have a potentially stronger hand than people realize going directly after former President Trump, someone he used to work with?
You know, because I think Christie's got the only hand that he's got, and that is to go after Trump. He did it before he announced, and he's kind of set that lane. And I don't think he has a real choice to, move in any other direction. Basically, what you've got right now over, as I see it in the Republican Party, are the MAGA Party, and you've got DeSantis in that category. You've got others that are very close that are talking about the same things. They're not going after the same issues with quite the intensity. And then you've got what I call the enablers, those who refuse to condemn Donald Trump, those who refuse to say that someone who's been twice impeached, twice indicted, $5 million verdict against him should not be the Republican nominee for that reason. You've got all the enablers. And then you've got Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson to a lesser extent. I think Will Hurd will be in that category that's trying to bring the Republican Party back to some sense of normalcy. But I don't think that, quite frankly, and I'd be interested in Charlie's take, I don't think that gives Christie a lane to the nomination. DeSantis is trying to play all sides to try to get that MAGA vote, but also have the perception that he is much more moderate for the general election.
Congressman, let's hear your take.
Well, it appears that Chris Christie is going to weaponize himself to take down Donald Trump. He may be an imperfect vessel, but nevertheless, I would argue that in order to beat Donald Trump, they're going to have to take him on frontally and directly. As a guy who's run 13 campaigns for office, you're not going to beat your opponent by treating Donald Trump, in this case, by treating him as if he's benign. They're going to have to go after him hard and be very direct in their attacks about what, and attack him from the right is what they need to do, why he is unfit and why he is going to help contribute to further Republican defeat. They have to make those arguments. Avoiding, not saying his name, avoiding this, hoping that they can get second place is not a strategy toward victory.
I want to get both of your takes on how the Supreme Court rulings will factor in to 2024. Congressman, let me start with you. You saw what President Biden had to say. This is not a normal court, he said on Friday. He's opposed to packing the court, but obviously, as you know, some Democrats want to do exactly that. You saw the momentum after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the midterm elections. Are Republicans concerned that this is only going to fuel Democratic voters to go to the polls and vote?
Well, certainly in the Dobbs decision case from last year, there's no doubt that has certainly energized the Democrats. So I thought the court erred in the Dobbs decision. But for example, on the student loan case, I think the court got that right. I think they got right some other cases, too, with respect to redistricting in Alabama. Yes, judicial review still matters when it relates to laws passed by legislators in state legislators on redistricting matters. So they didn't get everything wrong. They got some things right, got some things wrong. I thought they got the LGBT case wrong, even though, I think that was a mistake. But at the end of the day, I think that the court will not be the biggest issue. Abortion will be a big issue for Republicans in particular, along with, Donald Trump's continuing to look backwards, the whole January 6th narrative that he's been pushing. I think that's the big vulnerability for Republicans. January 6th, looking backwards, and abortion.
Senator Jones, what's your take? How much do you think these Supreme Court rulings are going to impact what we see happen in 2024?
I think they're going to have a big impact on close elections in the Senate in particular. I think it gives the Senate and the Democrats the ability to make the arguments about getting Supreme Court justices, getting judges in that are going to make decisions that do not overrule 50, 60 years of precedent. I think there'll be a bigger issue than what I think Charlie thought. I agree that some of the issues are not as hot button issues as the abortion decision, but people are looking at the court. It is why you are seeing so many people in the Democratic field, and I don't agree with this per se myself, about expanding the court, about getting term limits. That is a focus on the court and not just the issue. So I think this is, all of a sudden, Democrats have woken up and said, look, we messed up by not really getting Clinton elected in 2016 by losing this court. I think the courts are going to be a much bigger focus than they've ever been. That's my view.
All right. Fantastic conversation. Thank you, former Senator Doug Jones and former Congressman Charlie Dent. Hope you both have a great holiday. Thanks for being here. Up next, the White House monitors a major Israeli military offensive with drone strikes and gunfire lighting up a Palestinian city in the largest military operation in the West Bank in more than 20 years. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The White House says it is monitoring the situation in Israel after the country's military carried out a massive airstrike on the occupied West Bank earlier today. Its most intense strike on that territory in 2 decades. According to Israel's military, the operation included multiple drone strikes on, quote, terrorist infrastructure in the city of Jenin, followed by an incursion by ground forces. Palestinian health officials said at least 8 Palestinians were killed and more than 24 others were injured. Residents in the area reported hearing gunfire and explosions, and smoke could be seen rising across the city in the aftermath of the raid. As of midday today, Israeli troops still remained inside the Jenin refugee camp. The uptick comes as violence comes as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing increased pressure from the far-right wing of his coalition. Those members say they support the expansion of Israeli settlements and have called for a stronger response to the ongoing violence in the region. Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Josh Letterman. Josh, thanks so much for joining me. I think the big question a lot of folks have as they watch this uptick in violence is why is Israel launching these strikes and why now?
Well, the message from the Israeli government today, Kristen, has been essentially enough is enough. We had a briefing from the Israeli military spokesman who claimed that over the last many months, there have been some 50 terror attacks by Palestinians that have originated in this one refugee camp in Jenin. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, he held a meeting with his national security team, emerging from it to describe it as a nest of terrorists. And so Israel really sees a major counterterrorism issue when it comes to this refugee camp, which is in the northern part of the occupied West Bank. It is known to be a real stronghold of Palestinian opposition to the ongoing Israeli occupation. But of course, the Palestinians see this as totally barbaric. They have described this as a new war crime, and they are now calling for the Security Council of the United Nations to have an immediate meeting to deal with this. And so you can see how quickly this situation can begin to spiral out of control as we hear from the Israeli military that they're not going to stop this incursion until they feel they have reached the goals of eliminating this threat, no matter how long that takes.
And Josh, against that backdrop, I mean, how much concern is there in Israel about potential retaliation from the Palestinian Authority?
I don't think that's probably the top concern right now, because there has been such a limited ability for the Palestinian Authority to respond before. It is such a weakened entity. It hasn't had elections in years. We did hear from the Palestinian Authority just in the last few hours announcing that they are cutting off all communication with Israel. They are going to continue to resist any kind of security cooperation with Israel. But that was already so limited to begin with. The real concern, Kristen, is whether other militant groups, namely Hamas, as well as other Palestinian militant groups, get pulled into this, whether they see this as part of all of the same cause and begin to launch attacks at Israel, potentially from the Gaza Strip, from elsewhere in the West Bank. And so that is what Israeli authorities are watching very closely right now.
And Josh, just finally, we know that Netanyahu is facing some real pressure from the far right wing of his coalition. Talk to us a little bit about that. How much pressure is he getting, and could he lose control of his coalition over this?
Quite a bit of pressure, and he has had members of his far-right coalition essentially threaten to scuttle the government because they don't feel like he is going hard enough, not only in supporting the West Bank settlements that are at the root of so many of these tensions, but also in going after Palestinian militants in the West Bank. And so you've seen members of his own government, who frankly he needs, if they leave, his government falls apart. They are insisting that they want to see a full-scale military operation in the West Bank. Now, what that would look like compared to what we're seeing now, which is already the largest raid, as you pointed out, in decades, it's hard to tell. But certainly Netanyahu is being squeezed from people on his right within his government who want to see a very muscular Israeli government approach to dealing with these extremists and militants in the West Bank. That could potentially spell a lot more violence and bloodshed if the Israeli government decides to follow that call and really go full bore into the West Bank. Kristen?
Well, it's a volatile situation. We know you will continue to track it. Josh Lederman, thank you for your reporting. As we noted, the White House says it is monitoring the situation in the West Bank. I now want to bring in my colleague, NBC News White House correspondent Ali Rafa, for the very latest on that. So, Ali, what exactly is the White House saying about this latest escalation in violence?
Yeah, Kristen, good to be with you. Beyond this statement that we have from the State Department, there's still a lot more that we're waiting for from administration officials reacting to this situation. We have a statement from a State Department spokesperson who says, quote, "We support Israel's security and right to defend its people against Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist groups," adding, "Today's events further underscore the urgent need for Israeli and Palestinian security forces to work together to improve the security situation in the West Bank. It is imperative to take all possible precautions to prevent the loss of civilian lives." So we know the administration is closely monitoring this very fluid situation, no doubt trying to gather as much intelligence and information as it can before putting out a more concrete response with more details. Certainly a reaction from President Biden, who remains at Camp David until tomorrow, when he's expected to return to the White House. But But so far, this has been a very tricky situation, a delicate dance for the president. As we know, the U.S. supports Israel's security, but also supports Palestinian statehood and Palestinian rights. The administration has been openly criticizing, in some cases, Prime Minister Netanyahu's far-right coalition that, as you mentioned in that segment with Josh, has increased their pressure on the prime minister. So it'll be very interesting to see how the president eventually does respond to this ongoing situation, Kristen.
He will undoubtedly get questions about it when he returns to the White House tomorrow. Ali Rafa, thank you for your great reporting. We appreciate it. And next, ahead of tomorrow's 4th of July holiday, we are looking at how service members and their families are struggling with food insecurity and why high food prices are hitting military families so hard. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As millions of Americans across the country prepare for the July 4th holiday, food costs remain high, up 6.7% from this time last year. One group of Americans hit particularly hard: service members and their families. And many members of the U.S. military are now turning to food banks to help make ends meet. NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster has more.
Let's go. Let's roll.
Senior Navy Chief Andre Sutherland runs food pantries like training drills.
Pull up, sir. Keep going, please. The line wraps around the corner, all the way down the street.
Sutherland brings his recruits each week to help distribute food and clothing to local veterans and service members at the Midwest Veterans Closet.
Thank you for your service.
But he also relies on the pantry himself.
First time I was shy, I was apprehensive, and you're in the military. Everybody think we're making all this money, but we're not.
A 2022 Military Family Advisory Network survey of service members found 1 in 6 respondents are experiencing food insecurity, significantly higher than the general population. Finding military families are economically vulnerable because of factors like frequent moves, high rates of spousal unemployment, and how salary and housing allowances are considered for federal aid.
Let's explain a little bit about how the housing factors into the food insecurity.
Military families receive what's called a basic allowance for housing. The way that SNAP is calculated, it includes that basic allowance for housing in their calculation. And so most military families are not eligible.
It's a problem made worse by the pandemic and a year of high inflation.
I recently met with 12 other food bank CEOs representing food banks in Florida and Texas. They are all saying the same thing: an unprecedented need.
Very nice.
Navy wife and mom of 2, Josie, who asked us not to use her last name, recently got a part-time job to supplement her husband's salary.
It takes extreme budgeting skills and financial awareness to understand how much you need to save in order to survive.
She's frustrated by what she feels is a lack of government support.
They are aware of the problem, but they don't care. That's why I'm angry. That's why I'm frustrated.
The Department of Defense tells NBC News it takes the issue of food insecurity within the military community extremely seriously and is executing a holistic strategy of policies, programs, and other initiatives. But for some, those changes only go so far.
There we go. I never understood why veterans struggle so much or why military members struggle so much until I've seen it for myself. Thank you, ma'am. Food is one thing that we need to survive. That's like a big thing to survive, and me being part of this, it's very rewarding.
Service shifting from the front lines to the home front. Shaquille Brewster, NBC News, North Chicago, Illinois.
Our thanks to Shaquille Brewster for that great reporting. And in a sign of just how pervasive this problem is, the Defense Department says it has reduced prices of grocery items at air base commissaries, while advocacy groups are pushing for policy changes at the state and federal level. Up next, Ukraine's President Zelensky acknowledges his troops are having a difficult time on the front lines as Russia's defense minister appears publicly for the first time since the failed rebellion that tried to oust him. Plus, shows of solidarity and calls for calm in France after nearly a week of violent protests following a fatal police shooting of a teenager. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning now to the latest in the war in Ukraine, where President Zelensky says his troops have regained ground along Ukraine's eastern and southern fronts after what he describes as a difficult week of fighting. Ukrainian officials say they've taken back more than 14 square miles of territory as its military continues a counteroffensive. Meanwhile, Russian officials are trying to project a sense of normalcy, with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu making his first public comment since last weekend's rebellion by the Wagner Group. Shoigu says that the short-lived mutiny did not affect Russia's military operation in Ukraine. Joining me now is NBC's Kelly Kobyea from Dnipro, Ukraine. So, Kelly, just how confident are Ukrainian officials right now about their counteroffensive that's been taking place against the backdrop of all of the unrest in Russia?
Well, look, President Zelensky did say that it was a difficult week last week of fighting, but he also said that Ukrainian troops are making progress, that they're moving forward step by step. And the defense ministry keeps pointing out that, look, they've taken 9 villages since the offensive began. They've taken in total more than 70 square miles of land from the Russians, most of that in the south, but some in the east as well. The deputy defense minister is saying today that the situation in the east is changing rapidly, especially around Bakhmut, that they're encountering strong resistance from the Russians and that they are still making advances. But she says it's changing so quickly that they can gain and then lose and then regain territory, sometimes twice a day in that area. I think it's also important to remember the words of the defense minister who spoke to the Financial Times last week and said what you're seeing is not the main event. He said when the main offensive begins, you'll see it, you'll know. He said the main troops, Western trained troops with NATO tanks, still aren't in the fight. Kristen.
That is a fascinating data point, Kelly. And very quickly, do Ukrainian officials think that the unrest in Russia is actually helping them in this moment?
I think it's not clear to them right now. It's not clear to anyone, really. Again, the defense ministry pointing out that they don't think any Wagner fighters are in the east anymore. Of course, the Wagner fighters are those fighters who were so instrumental in capturing Bakhmut back in May. But on the other hand, they say there are 50,000 Russian troops in that area, again, putting up stiff resistance. Now, according to an article in the Washington Post reporting last week, that the Ukrainians are confident that by the fall they can take back substantial territory, and they say they have a plan for that. Kristen.
Kelly Kobyea, please continue to stay safe. Thank you for that reporting. We do want to turn now to France, where the violent protests that have been roiling the country every night for nearly a week now appears to be calming down. Police say they arrested more than 150 nationwide last night, but that's down from more than 1,300 arrests in a single night last week. The riots were sparked by the fatal shooting of a 17-year-old by a police officer. NBC's Matt Bradley is live in Paris with the very latest. So, Matt, do police at this point believe this is a lull in the violence, or do they think it's actually coming to an end at this point?
It's hard to tell. I mean, the police are already deploying, and the Interior Minister has put out 45,000 troops all across the country. That's a similar number to what we've seen over the past several nights. So clearly, they're preparing for the worst once again. But as you mentioned, it does look as though we're seeing an ebb here. There were only 157 people arrested last night. That's way down from what we saw over the weekend. The violence has clearly decreased. I spoke with some public officials earlier today, and they told me that, yes, it does look like there's been a pause. They don't know why. They don't know why this escalated so quickly, and they don't know why it simmered down so fast as well. But it's clear that something has happened. Over the weekend, some family members of Nael, that 17-year-old boy who was shot dead by police at a traffic checkpoint, appealed for calm, pleaded with protesters to stop the destruction. But also it looks as though public authorities and forces of order have managed to take a tenuous hold on both public safety and on public opinion, because it looks as though the public opinion is kind of turning against the protesters. We saw right here in this town a massive demonstration against the protest movement. It was led by some right-wing officials, but this town outside of Paris, where I am now, was active with a lot of protests. And actually, the mayor's house, his private home, was rammed by a car filled with protesters. They tried to set it on fire. And when his wife and 2 children tried to flee, they were attacked with firebombs by the protesters. And the mayor's wife was badly injured. She actually broke her leg, and one of his children was also slightly injured. So these sorts of searing images that the French public have been seeing over the past week have really made the protesters even more unpopular and increased calls among the public for the police to clamp down very hard. Tonight is going to be the real test as to whether or not this movement is going to sustain itself. Kristen?
We know that you will be watching it closely. Very powerful to hear from the victim's family. Matt Bradley, thank you for your reporting. We'll be back tomorrow on the 4th of July with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.